So hello there, welcome to my video podcast. This is called We Need a Renaissance, Not Another Revolution. Jean-Jacques Rousseau got it backwards when he said man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. On the contrary, all men, and women too, are born into a state of radical dependence. We come into this world attached to the mother, to the family, to the tribe. Only after a great struggle can we dream of any kind of relative freedom. Freedom or individuality could only exist in a web of responsibility, hierarchy, and interdependence. When John Lennon wrote the song Imagine, he was similarly off the mark. Imagine is a sort of ultimate hymn to romanticism. That is its anthemic power, but also its tragic insufficiency. Do we really want to imagine the world that Lennon sings about, with no hell below us and above us only sky? Is that not a world without depth or mythology, and ironically without imagination? Perhaps we need to imagine heavens and hells, and perhaps there is more existential realism and imagination, for that matter, in the song I Am the Walrus. Don't get me wrong. There is something great in romantic movements. They rip out the dead roots of tradition when such traditions have become empty and formal. They regenerate the culture. And yet revolutions become the Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. Today it seems obvious that the romantic counterculture is this serpent eating itself, that it has become its own oppressor. Intersectionality, safe spaces, microaggression. These are not the big themes of real revolution, but academic quackery, a sound and fury signifying nothing. The activity of masked Antifa groups who do not engage in debate, but various forms of primal scream therapy and actual fascist behavior, making them the ultimate hypocrites and right-wing enablers, should be evidence enough for the impotence of radical revolutionary movements in the early part of the 21st century. Revolutionary movements, such as those which took place in the Soviet Union, have failed miserably in their totalizing goal of absolute equality. They have proved again and again that some people are more equal than others, as George Orwell once joked. And even if we succeed in replacing kings with uber administrators, the dynamics of power remain the same. Today, the Russian president is richer and more inaccessible than any medieval czar had ever been. When the spring of giddy political freedom is over, the revolutionary workers will invariably clamor for new and sometimes more repressive monsters. Hierarchies have proved themselves to be deep and intractable. They invade every aspect of our lives, and the most violent revolutions cannot overturn them. So what to do? Perhaps we need a renaissance and not a revolution. Maybe the answer to the nihilism of the times is to integrate and renew traditions rather than to just do away with them. We could go deep into our origins, study the great traditions as deeply as we can, find out what our motivations are beyond ideology. The age of ideology is over. And even if the ghosts of ideology still hold massive sway, the good news is that they are committing suicide everywhere. In the past, we needed walled cities to keep out plagues and strangers, as well as strict hierarchies to regulate relationships. Inequality and degree were embedded into every individual, family, and institution. In Troilus and Cressida, Shakespeare wrote, "Oh, when degree is shaken, which is the ladder to all high designs, the enterprise is sick. Take degree away, untune that string, and hard what discord follows." When degree is shaken, in other words, when people lose their sense of identity and distinction, there is sure to be chaos. In the past, peace depended not on equality, except in that everybody was equally different, but on place. Certainly few would want to return to such a fixed cosmos. Most of us would agree that human rights, universal access to a justice system, education, healthcare, all of these are desirable. Furthermore, we believe we should be judged on our skills and talents rather than our social position and gender. These are some of the unquestioned foundational principles of the modern secular world, and they seem to be pretty solid. Still, it is interesting to consider that these truths related to equality are not always self-evident. To illustrate the danger of equality, René Girard has used the example of twins. According to him, twins were once universally feared, and they were often abandoned or killed. They represented an uncanny replication, a double that inspired genuine horror. Why? Girard suggests that if there was too much sameness or equality in the hierarchy, there was a danger of rivalry and contagious violence. In the past, one situated oneself on a vertical hierarchy, with God on the top and the devil below. Distinction and rank was everything. Our distinctive place in the cosmic order was not the least bit arbitrary, and maintaining it kept society from collapsing. Pointing this out is just to show that hierarchies are so embedded in the human experience, and perhaps our task should be to make them more healthy, conscious, and fair, rather than trying to remove them wholesale. We need an up and a down, a good and an evil, a big and a small. We need vertical depth, not just horizontal, universal rights. And good hierarchies actually allow us to express our virtue in relation to others. Today we believe we are too enlightened to serve gods, and yet we serve movie stars and ideologies. We go to stadiums and worship rock stars, and yet we believe ourselves to be beyond religion. We might not believe in religion, but we enact it regardless, despite ourselves. In truth, we want godly beings to rule over us, maybe even more than we want equal rights. We may believe in equality, but still we tremble and bow to a person of greater rank, even if that person is a particularly terrible politician whom we loathe. The mystical aura still hangs over those in power. Moreover, even the most empirical scientist worships his data and the miracles of nature and dreams of a greater universe to which he cannot possibly be equal to. In that sense, the atheist may still retain a salutary fear of God, which he just calls the universe. As an illustration of the intractable nature of religion, some of my students worship in the church of heavy metal music. They engage in a series of communal exercises, going to concerts, and contemplations of heavy metal music, listening to songs. They wear costumes and esoteric signs of membership, tattoos for instance. And even if they consider themselves to be nonconformists, they conform strictly to the dogmatic rules of the church of heavy metal music, with its temples or concert halls and its theological principles. They have a history as well. There is an official hierarchy of great bands, as well as a multitude of heretical subgroups. As a young songwriter, I tried to emulate Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, in turn, learned from Woody Guthrie, who also had his traditional sources. I was absorbing the informal lineage and hierarchy of folk musicians, which updates itself throughout time. I couldn't even have begun to write a song before studying that tradition, before copying its norms and assimilating the rules and axioms, which meant listening to records and imitating the masters. Every tradition has its canon of heroes. The romantic error I made as a young person, in the revolutionary spirit of Rousseau and Lenin, was not to embrace the limitations of a tradition, which turn out to be freeing. I would have been a better guitar player if I had more formal musical training, but I was blinkered by that whole 60s notion of spontaneous freedom. Individual expression is really nothing but an illusion without lineage, and we cannot create anything without knowing our artistic and spiritual lineages. Still, Every tradition becomes heartless and tyrannical if it is not renewed constantly, popular song included. It doesn't follow, however, that every tradition is by nature something oppressive that needs to be transcended. I'm not a Catholic, but every time I walk by Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris where I live, I feel crushed by the weight of something so much greater than it could be conceived of in my own puny imagination. It's fashionable to talk about the corruption of the Catholic Church, and yet the greatness of Catholic culture is in evidence all around, especially in Europe. Churches provide a shelter for contemplation in a busy world, even for atheists or tourists. How ugly our modern cities would be without their temples. Churches or temples are the original institutions for human worship. Aren't they proof enough that human beings are made to worship what is great, religious or otherwise? Traditions can be as much about wisdom and competence as they are about maintaining power. Traditions are good, for one thing, because the heroes of our tradition can give us something to aspire to. They are conscious ways of regulating hierarchies, which seem to be intractable, even in our biological nature. Hierarchies will always exist in any case, just as there will always be an up and a down. We can consciously embrace traditions or be unconsciously animated by them. The Romantics were right to say that emancipation does lie in the individual, but the individual also contains the tradition within him or herself. Only the individual can renew that tradition, which will be dead and mechanical without his or her participation. The individual is key, as the Romantics understood, but we actually forfeit our individuality when we neglect or abandon our ancestral wisdom traditions, just as when we adhere to them blindly. There is a delicate balance between dogma and freedom to uphold, in other words. The individual stands between tradition and nature, at the very center. He or she becomes a hero, not by overturning or burning down the temples of tradition, but by creatively and humbly renewing them constantly. Recently, I asked a classroom of students if they had any heroes. They seemed almost insulted by the very idea. I've noticed that young people these days, who tend to be cynical about hierarchy, are dismissive of having heroes, but this is a mistake. Kids and adults need their heroes. We need to worship, to bow down to something greater than ourselves. The traditions contain keys to a library that is inexhaustibly rich. We can't find our individual voice without them. The narcissist doesn't acknowledge this. He or she can only see the mirror. Again, there is wisdom in laying ourselves down at the feet of the gods, whoever they may be. The great Leonard Cohen in my case. Maybe it is even more important to worship than it is to be free or equal to somebody. In any case, equality is not the whole story. It provides no inspiration for aiming high. In any case, people are religious, whether they want to be or not. We may never worship the sun god or fear damnation with the same intensity as we did in the past, and yet there are still higher and lower principles to serve. Bob Dylan put it best in his song, Gotta Serve Somebody. You're gonna have to serve somebody. You're gonna have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Thank you.